I found out that my husband and sister are playing house with my newborn while I was at work. So I ruined all their plans and left them in the gutter. I went back to work 6 weeks after having my daughter, Julie, because we needed the money, and my husband, Brett, said he could handle the days while working nights at the warehouse. My sister Chloe had just lost her job and offered to help with the baby during the day so Brett could sleep before his shifts. It seemed perfect since Chloe loved Julie and was staying in our guest room until she got back on her feet. I'd leave at 7 in the morning for my job at the medical center, pump during breaks, and rush home by 5:30 to take over. Brett would be getting up for his 8 a.m. MR shift, and Chloe would help with dinner and the bedtime routine. For 3 weeks, everything ran smoothly. Brett was getting enough sleep, Julie was happy, and Chloe seemed to really enjoy helping out. She'd send me pictures during the day of Julie's tummy time or her first real smile. I was grateful to have family support since my mom lived across the country, and Brett's parents weren't interested in being grandparents. Then little things started feeling off. I'd come home and Brett would be freshly showered even though he was supposed to just be waking up. Chloe would be wearing my robe, saying hers was in the wash. Julie would be in outfits I didn't recognize, and when I asked, Chloe said she bought them as surprises. Brett started criticizing how I did things with Julie, saying I was holding her wrong or feeding her too much, which was weird since he'd never cared about baby stuff before. One day I forgot my breast pump parts and had to drive home at lunch. I walked in quietly because Julie might be napping. That's when I heard them in the living room. Brett was laughing at something on TV while Chloe was folded into his side on the couch, Julie sleeping on her chest. They looked like a family. I stood there watching, and Chloe said something about how this was so much better than her old life. Brett kissed the top of her head and said they made a good team. Neither of them saw me. That night, I tested them. I mentioned how tired Brett looked for someone who'd been sleeping all day. He said taking care of a baby was exhausting. Chloe jumped in saying Brett had been so hands-on with Julie, doing all the feedings and changes. But Julie was exclusively breastfed from bottles I pumped, and I'd been marking them. Half weren't being used. They were giving her formula. When I asked about it, they said Julie seemed hungrier than what I was providing. They'd made that decision together without asking me. The next morning, I called in sick but left the house like normal. I parked down the street and waited an hour before walking back. The door was locked, which was weird because I never locked it when leaving. I used my key and found Brett making breakfast in boxers while Chloe sat at the table in my silk nightgown, the one Brett bought me for our anniversary. Julie was in her bouncer between them. They were discussing weekend plans like I didn't exist. When they saw me, Brett grabbed a shirt and Chloe pulled the nightgown closed. I asked why Chloe was wearing my clothes. She said she'd spilled coffee on her pajamas. They looked at each other, having some silent conversation. That's when Julie started crying and they both rushed to her. Brett picked her up and started bouncing her the way I do. Chloe grabbed the bottle I'd prepared and handed it to him. They worked in sync, like they'd been doing this routine for weeks. I realized they had been. Every day while I was gone, they were playing house with my baby. I went to work the next day but told my supervisor I was taking my accumulated maternity leave effective immediately, just needed to wrap up some cases. She approved it for starting the following Monday. I didn't tell Brett or Chloe. Instead, I watched them closer. Brett was leaving for work later and later, sometimes not until 9. Chloe was doing our laundry together, Brett's boxers mixed with her underwear. They'd made a shared playlist on the speaker. Saturday, I said I had to go in for an emergency shift. Instead, I went to my friend Diana's house and watched our Ring doorbell camera from my phone. At 10 a.m., Chloe and Brett came out with Julie in the stroller I bought. They walked to the farmer's market holding hands, Brett pushing the stroller while Chloe linked her arm through his. They looked like every other young couple with a baby. People stopped them to coo at Julie and they'd smile, accepting compliments like proud parents. Sunday night, I acted normal. Monday morning, I got dressed for work and left. Brett barely said goodbye, already texting Chloe to come downstairs. I drove around the corner and called them both into a conference call. I told them my maternity leave started today so they didn't need to watch Julie anymore. Dead silence. Then Brett asked what I meant. I said I'd be home with Julie for the next 8 weeks, fully paid, so Chloe could focus on job hunting and Brett could actually sleep during the days. Chloe started stuttering about still wanting to help. I said that wouldn't be necessary since I'd enrolled Julie in Mommy and Me classes every morning. Then, while Brett was sleeping, I took his phone and checked their messages. I dropped the phone when I found out their plans. I picked the phone back up with hands that wouldn't stop shaking and kept scrolling through their messages. The conversation went back weeks, maybe longer. Brett had sent Chloe a message the day after she moved in saying how nice it was to have her around. She'd replied with a heart emoji. Then more messages about Julie, about how natural they felt together taking care of her. Chloe wrote that she'd never felt so happy and complete. Brett said he felt the same way. My throat got tight reading how they talked about me. Brett called me cold and distant, said I cared more about work than my own family. Chloe agreed and said I'd always been selfish, even as kids. They talked about Julie like she was theirs, planning her first birthday party together, discussing what kind of mom Chloe would be. Then I found the message from 3 days ago where Brett said they needed to make a plan. Chloe asked what he meant. Brett wrote that he wanted to be with her, that they should be Julie's parents, that I was barely around anyway. Chloe sent back a long message about how Julie already saw them as her real parents, how she called out for Chloe during the night, how she smiled more with them than with me. None of that was true, but they were building a story. Brett's next message laid it all out. He'd tell me he wanted a divorce and full custody of Julie. He'd use my work schedule against me, say I chose my job over my baby. Chloe would back him up as a witness. They'd already talked to someone about it, some friend of Brett's who said judges usually sided with the parent who'd been doing the primary caregiving. My stomach felt like it was full of rocks. They were going to take my daughter. I started taking screenshots of everything, my hands moving fast even though they were shaking. Every message, every plan, every lie they'd told about me. I opened Brett's email on his phone and sent all the screenshots to my own email address. Then I forwarded them again to my personal cloud storage and my work email. I wanted copies everywhere, so he couldn't delete them or claim his phone got wiped. The emails showed as sent from his account, so he'd know exactly what I'd found and that I had proof. I looked over at Brett still sleeping in our bed, snoring softly like he didn't have a care in the world. This man I'd been married to for 4 years, who I'd trusted with everything, who I'd made a baby with. He was planning to destroy me and steal our daughter. I wanted to scream at him or hit him with something, but instead I put his phone back on the nightstand exactly where he'd left it. I went downstairs and found them both on the couch where I'd left them. Julie was still sleeping on Chloe's chest. Brett must have come down while I was upstairs because he was sitting next to Chloe now, their bodies pressed together. They both looked up when they heard me on the stairs and their faces went guilty immediately. Chloe's hand moved to Brett's knee. I stood at the bottom of the stairs looking at them for a long moment. They looked so nervous, like kids caught doing something wrong. I kept my voice calm and quiet so I wouldn't wake Julie. I told them I found everything and asked how long this had been going on. Brett's face went red and he started to stand up, but I held up my hand to stop him. Chloe pulled Julie closer to her chest like she was protecting her from me. That made me so mad I could barely see straight, but I kept my voice level. Brett tried to say the messages were taken out of context, that I was misunderstanding what I'd read. His voice had that fake, reasonable tone he used when he was lying. I just stared at him and waited. Chloe started crying then, these big dramatic sobs that made Julie stir against her. She said between gasps that they'd had feelings for each other since she moved in. She said it just happened naturally because they were spending so much time together with Julie. She actually said it like that, like it was something that just happened to them instead of something they chose to do. I told Chloe she had until tomorrow morning to pack her things and get out of my house. She started to argue, saying she had nowhere to go, that she couldn't afford a place yet. I cut her off and said she should have thought about that before she decided to sleep with my husband. My voice got louder on that last part, and Julie woke up crying. Chloe tried to calm her, but I walked over and took Julie from her arms. Chloe looked like I'd slapped her. Brett stood up then and said we needed to talk about this like adults and figure out what was best for Julie. I held Julie against my shoulder and looked right at him. I told him the best thing for Julie was not having her father play house with her aunt while lying to her mother. His jaw got tight and I could see him trying to control his temper. I didn't wait for him to respond. I took Julie and went upstairs to the nursery and locked the door behind us. I could hear them talking downstairs in hushed, angry voices, but I couldn't make out the words. I sat in the rocking chair and fed Julie, trying to focus on her, and not on the fact that my entire life had just fallen apart. My hands were still shaking and tears kept running down my face, but I kept feeding her and rocking. When Julie fell asleep, I put her in the crib and pulled out my phone. I called Camilla, and when she answered, I just started talking, telling her everything about the messages and their plans and what they'd been doing. She didn't interrupt once, just listened while I talked. When I finally stopped, she said she was coming to get me and Julie right now, that we could stay with her as long as we needed. I told her I wasn't leaving my house. This was my home and I wasn't going to let them push me out of it. But I said I needed her help figuring out my next steps because I had no idea what to do. She said she'd be there in an hour and to not talk to Brett or Chloe until she arrived. She told me to stay in the nursery with the door locked. I said okay, and we hung up. I sat on the floor next to Julie's crib and just watched her sleep. She looked so peaceful, totally unaware that her whole world was about to change. I heard footsteps in the hallway, and then Brett tried the door handle. It didn't open because of the lock. He knocked softly and said my name, but I didn't answer. He tried again a few minutes later, knocking harder this time and saying we needed to talk. I still didn't respond. Eventually, I heard him walk away. Camilla showed up exactly an hour later and I heard her voice downstairs. I unlocked the nursery door and found her in the hallway. She was carrying her laptop and a notebook. She gave me a long hug and then we went back into the nursery and locked the door again. She sat on the floor with me and opened her laptop. She said she was a paralegal and she was going to help me document everything. We spent the next 2 hours going through the timeline of events, writing down every suspicious thing that had happened, every lie they'd told, every time they'd made decisions about Julie without asking me. I showed her all the screenshots and she helped me organize them by date. She made a list of what I needed to do to protect myself and Julie legally. Get a lawyer first thing in the morning. Don't leave the house. Don't let Chloe be alone with Julie. Document everything Brett says and does. She was so calm and organized, and it made me feel like maybe I could actually handle this. When she finally left around midnight, I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. I lay on the floor next to Julie's bassinet, watching her breathe and running through everything in my head over and over. How had I missed all the signs? How long had they been planning this? What else had they lied about? Brett tried the door 2 more times during the night, but I pretended to be asleep. I heard him walk away both times. I barely slept at all, maybe an hour total. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those messages or pictured them together with Julie. By the time the sun came up, I felt sick and exhausted, but I also felt something else. I felt determined. They weren't going to take my daughter from me, and they weren't going to make me the bad guy in this story. I had evidence and I had a plan, and I was going to fight back with everything I had. The sun came up around 6 and I heard movement downstairs. I picked up Julie and went to check Chloe's room. The door was open and the bed was stripped. Her clothes were gone from the closet and the dresser drawers hung open and empty. She'd left some makeup containers on the bathroom counter and a few hangers on the floor, but otherwise it looked like she'd never been there. I went downstairs with Julie and found Brett sitting at the kitchen table still wearing yesterday's clothes. He looked up when I walked in and opened his mouth to say something, but I walked past him to make Julie's bottle. He watched me measure the formula and warm the water. I sat in the living room to feed her and he followed me in and sat on the other couch. He said we needed to talk about our marriage and what we were going to do. I didn't look at him. I told him there was nothing to talk about except divorce terms. His face went pale and he leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. He said I was being rash and we should try counseling first, that every marriage goes through rough patches. I actually laughed out loud at that. I asked him if he went to counseling before he decided to sleep with my sister. He sat back like I'd slapped him. Then his whole face changed and he got defensive. He said I was never home anyway, that I was always at work or too tired to pay attention to him when I got back. He said Chloe made him feel appreciated and noticed, that she actually cared about how his day went. I finished feeding Julie and put her over my shoulder to burp her. I told him I was going to call my supervisor and take the rest of my maternity leave. He asked what that meant for us and I said there was no us anymore. I took Julie upstairs and changed her diaper and put her down for her morning nap. Then I went into my bedroom and called Anya. I explained that I was dealing with some personal issues and needed to extend my leave. She didn't ask questions. She just said to take the full 12 weeks and my job would be waiting when I was ready. She told me to focus on my baby and myself and not worry about work. I thanked her and hung up. Brett tried to talk to me 2 more times that day, but I ignored him completely. That night, he moved his stuff into the guest room without me asking him to. The next 2 days were silent and tense. He kept trying to start conversations about working things out, but I'd walk away or leave the room. I focused entirely on Julie and taking care of myself. I called Camilla on the 2nd day and asked if she still had that lawyer's contact information. She texted me Fletcher Cleary's number within 5 minutes. I called his office and explained my situation to the receptionist. She said he was completely booked, but when I mentioned the affair and custody concerns, she put me on hold. Fletcher got on the line and told me to come in that afternoon at 3. I packed up all the screenshots and printed out the text messages. I made a timeline of everything that had happened and put together the photos from the Ring camera. I showed up at Fletcher's office with Julie in her car seat and a folder full of evidence. He was maybe 40 with gray starting at his temples, and he shook my hand and offered me coffee. We sat in his conference room and I laid everything out. He went through each message carefully and made notes. He looked at the Ring camera photos for a long time. Then he leaned back in his chair and told me I had a strong case for full custody. He said the affair was bad enough, but their plan to alienate me from Julie and claim I was an absent mother was going to work against Brett badly. He explained that Brett's night shift schedule meant he couldn't actually be Julie's primary caregiver during the day like he was claiming. The fact that they'd been feeding her formula without my knowledge and leaving her with Chloe while he slept completely destroyed any argument that he was the primary parent. Fletcher said we should file immediately and ask for temporary full custody while the divorce was pending. I signed the retainer agreement that afternoon. Fletcher filed the divorce papers 3 days later. He had Brett served at the warehouse during his shift. Brett came home around midnight and slammed the front door so hard it shook the walls. He came upstairs and pounded on my bedroom door. I opened it with Julie in my arms and he started yelling about how I blindsided him and didn't even try to save our marriage. I kept my voice calm and quiet because Julie was sleeping. I told him he was planning to divorce me anyway according to his messages with Chloe. I just beat him to it. He tried to argue, but I closed the door in his face and locked it. The next week, Brett hired Lee Takahashi as his attorney. I got a letter in the mail claiming that Brett had been Julie's primary caregiver during the day while I worked, and he deserved 50-50 custody. The letter said I had abandoned my infant daughter to go back to work, and left her care entirely to Brett. It made me so angry I had to put it down and walk away. I called Fletcher and read him the letter. He told me not to worry and to send him everything I had about the formula feeding and Chloe's involvement. I forwarded him the ring camera footage showing Brett and Chloe leaving the house with Julie while I was supposedly at work. I sent him the photos of them at the farmer's market holding hands. I documented every bottle of breast milk I'd marked that hadn't been used, and the formula containers I'd found hidden in the back of the pantry. Fletcher called me back 2 hours later and said this evidence completely destroyed their primary caregiver argument. He said the video of them presenting themselves as a couple with Julie in public while lying to me about their relationship showed terrible judgment. The fact that they'd made major decisions about Julie's feeding without consulting me as her mother demonstrated they weren't putting her best interests first. 2 days after Fletcher laid out the evidence, Brett's mom, Melanie, called me for the first time since Julie was born. Her voice came through the phone all sweet and concerned, asking how I was doing and saying she'd heard Brett and I were having some trouble. I stayed quiet and let her talk. She went on about how families need to stick together, especially when there's a baby involved, and how Julie deserves to have both her parents in the same house. I waited until she finished her whole speech before I responded. I told her she didn't give a single thought to Julie being her granddaughter until Brett needed someone to make him look good in court. She started to argue, but I cut her off and said if she actually cared about Julie, she would have shown up in the last 3 months instead of now when her son was facing consequences. She got quiet and then tried a different approach, saying Brett made a mistake but he loves Julie and I shouldn't keep them apart. I reminded her that Brett was planning to keep Julie from me permanently with Chloe, so her concern seemed pretty selective. She hung up on me after that. The next morning my phone rang again and this time it was Chloe. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her at first. She kept saying she was so sorry, and she never meant to hurt me, and she didn't know how things got so messed up. I sat there listening to her sob and apologize, talking about how she realizes now what she did was terrible, and she wishes she could take it all back. She said she was staying with a friend across town and she missed Julie and she missed me. Part of me wanted to scream at her, to tell her exactly what I thought about her sleeping with my husband and trying to steal my baby. But I didn't say anything at all. I just hung up the phone and blocked her number. I didn't owe her forgiveness or closure or anything else. I called my mom that afternoon and told her everything that had happened, the affair, the messages, the custody battle, all of it. She was on a plane the next day. When I picked her up from the airport, she hugged me so tight I almost started crying for the first time since I found those messages. She was absolutely furious with both Brett and Chloe. On the drive home, she kept saying she couldn't believe her own daughter would do something like that, and how could Brett think he could get away with planning to take Julie from me? The minute we got to the house, she took over with Julie, so I could focus on getting ready for court. She did all the feedings I wasn't doing myself, handled the diaper changes, rocked Julie to sleep, and basically made sure I had time to meet with Fletcher and organize all my evidence. Having her there made everything feel slightly less impossible. A week later, I got a notice that the court was ordering us to try mediation before we could move forward with contested custody. Fletcher said this was standard procedure and I needed to go even though it probably wouldn't work. I agreed because I had to, but I already knew I wasn't going to compromise on Julie living with me full-time. Brett could have visits, but Julie's home was with me. The mediation happened in a conference room at the courthouse with a mediator named Mrs. Richardson, who looked about 60 and seemed tired before we even started. Lee sat next to Brett on one side of the table while Fletcher and I sat on the other. Mrs. Richardson explained the process and said she hoped we could reach an agreement that was best for Julie without having to go to trial. Then she asked Lee to present Brett's position. Lee started talking about how Brett had been Julie's daytime parent for the first 3 months of her life while I went back to work. He said Brett had been hands-on with all of Julie's care, feeding her, changing her, putting her down for naps, and he deserved equal parenting time because he'd proven he could handle it. I felt Fletcher shift in his seat next to me, and I knew he was ready. When Lee finished, Fletcher pulled out the folder with all my evidence. He explained that Brett was supposed to be sleeping during the day while working nights, and that my sister Chloe had actually been the one watching Julie. He showed the formula containers and the marked breast milk bottles that proved they'd been making feeding decisions without consulting me. Then he pointed out that if Brett was really Julie's primary daytime caregiver, he wouldn't have needed Chloe there at all. Lee looked annoyed but tried to argue that Chloe was just helping out as family support. Richardson held up her hand and turned to Brett directly. She asked him to explain his relationship with Chloe, and exactly how involved she was in Julie's daily care. Brett's face got red and he glanced at Lee before answering. He admitted that Chloe had helped with Julie, but he tried to make it sound minor, saying she was just supporting the family and being a good aunt. Mrs. Richardson asked if Chloe lived in our home, and Brett had to say yes. She asked if Chloe was present during the day while he was supposed to be sleeping, and again he had to say yes. Fletcher saw his opening and pulled out his phone. He'd loaded the Ring camera footage onto it, and he slid it across the table to Mrs. Richardson. The video showed Brett and Chloe leaving the house with Julie in the stroller, walking to the farmer's market holding hands and stopping to talk to people who clearly thought they were a couple with a baby. Brett's face went from red to almost purple. Lee looked completely frustrated and asked Brett why he hadn't disclosed this. Brett started stammering about how it wasn't what it looked like, but Fletcher cut in with the text messages. He'd printed out the ones where Brett and Chloe discussed their relationship and their plans to be together with Julie. Richardson read through them with her mouth pressed into a thin line. She asked if Brett and Chloe were romantically involved, and Brett finally admitted they were. She asked how long this had been going on, and Brett said about a month. I spoke up for the first time and said it had been going on since at least 3 weeks after Julie was born, based on the messages. Mrs. Richardson looked at me and asked what custody arrangement I was willing to agree to. I said Brett could have daytime visits, but I wasn't comfortable with overnight visits until Julie was older and fully weaned from breastfeeding. Brett exploded. He said I was being vindictive and using Julie as a weapon to punish him. He said I was trying to keep his daughter away from him just because I was mad about Chloe. I stayed calm and said he was the one who planned to keep Julie from me permanently, so he could handle supervised visits for a few months until we had a final custody order. Mrs. Richardson tried to get us to compromise, but I wouldn't budge on the overnight visits, and Brett wouldn't accept anything less than 50-50 custody. After 2 hours, she declared the mediation unsuccessful and said we'd have to let a judge decide. Fletcher filed for temporary full custody the next day. He argued that Julie was still very young and exclusively breastfed, that I was her primary parent and had been since birth, and that Brett's relationship with Chloe showed poor judgment when it came to Julie's care. The hearing for temporary custody happened a week later. The judge read through all the evidence, looked at the Ring camera footage, and reviewed the text messages. She asked Brett's attorney if he had any evidence that Brett had been Julie's primary caregiver, and Lee couldn't produce anything solid. The judge granted me temporary full custody pending the final hearing. She said Brett could have supervised daytime visits 3 times a week at my discretion, meaning I got to decide when and where they happened. Brett looked like someone had punched him in the stomach. When we left the courtroom, he followed me into the hallway and started yelling about how I was keeping his daughter from him. I turned around and looked him straight in the eye. I told him he was planning to keep Julie from me permanently according to his own messages, so he could deal with limited visits for a few months until the court made a final decision. He tried to argue, but Fletcher stepped between us and told Brett to communicate through his attorney from now on. I walked away with my mom waiting by the exit holding Julie's car seat, and for the first time since I found those messages, I felt like maybe I was going to be okay. The first visit happened 3 days later on a Wednesday afternoon. I spent the morning pumping extra milk and filling bottles, labeling each one with the date and time so I could track everything. My mom had flown back in the night before, and she sat at the kitchen table watching me organize the bottles in the fridge. Brett arrived at exactly 2 o'clock and knocked on the door even though he still had his key. My mom answered and stepped aside to let him in without saying anything. He looked terrible, like he hadn't slept in days, and he barely glanced at me before asking where Julie was. I brought her down from her nap and handed her to him along with a bottle. He took her awkwardly, holding her too stiffly, and sat on the couch while my mom positioned herself in the armchair across from him. I went upstairs to give them space, but I could hear everything through the baby monitor I'd left on. Julie fussed for the first 10 minutes and Brett kept trying to bounce her too hard. My mom had to tell him twice to support her head better. He fed her the bottle I'd prepared and burped her when my mom reminded him, then just sat there scrolling through his phone while Julie dozed on his chest. The whole visit lasted 2 hours, and when I came back down, he handed Julie to me without making eye contact. My mom walked him to the door and I heard her tell him his next visit was Friday at the same time. Friday's visit started the same way, but 20 minutes in, someone knocked on the door. My mom answered it, and I heard Chloe's voice asking if she could come in. My mom said no. This was Brett's time with his daughter, and Chloe needed to leave. Chloe started saying something about just wanting to help with Julie, but my mom cut her off and said if Brett wanted to see Julie, his mistress needed to stay away from this house. Brett heard everything from the living room and stood up, still holding Julie. He came to the doorway and told my mom that Chloe had every right to be there. My mom turned around and looked at him with this cold expression I'd never seen before. She told him the court order said nothing about Chloe being present during visits, and if he pushed it, she'd call Fletcher right now and have the visits moved to a supervised facility. Brett's face went red, but he didn't argue. Chloe left, and my mom closed the door, then went back to her chair like nothing had happened. Brett barely interacted with Julie for the rest of the visit, just held her and stared at the wall. I made an appointment with a therapist named Dr. Sarah Abel for the following Tuesday. I sat in her office for an hour and told her everything, the affair, the messages, the custody battle, how I couldn't even look at Brett without wanting to scream. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she asked me what I wanted for Julie's relationship with her father. I said I wanted Julie to have a dad who actually cared about her, not someone who only wanted custody to win against me. Dr. Abel spent the rest of the session helping me figure out how to separate my anger at Brett from what Julie needed. She said kids can sense when their parents hate each other and it affects them even when they're babies. I left feeling like maybe I could do this co-parenting thing without losing my mind, but it was going to take a lot of work. 2 days later, my friend Jessica called and said she'd run into Brett's cousin at the grocery store. The cousin had told her that Brett was telling everyone I'd abandoned Julie to focus on my career and basically forced him into Chloe's arms because I was never home. I was still processing that when my phone rang again, and it was Melanie. She started screaming before I could even say hello, calling me a selfish witch who was poisoning Julie against her father. She said I was using the baby as a weapon, and that Brett was a wonderful father who deserved equal time. I tried to get a word in, but she just kept going, saying I'd trapped Brett with a pregnancy, and now I was punishing him for being honest about his feelings. I finally told her that Brett had been planning to take Julie from me completely, according to his own text messages. Then I hung up. She called back 4 times, but I didn't answer. The next morning, Melanie showed up at my house unannounced. I was feeding Julie in the living room when I heard the doorbell. My mom answered, and I heard Melanie demanding to see her granddaughter. My mom told her to leave, but Melanie pushed past her and came into the living room. She walked right up to me and tried to take Julie out of my arms, saying she was taking her granddaughter for a walk. I pulled Julie away and told Melanie to get out of my house. She started yelling about grandparents' rights and how I couldn't keep her from Julie. My mom called 911 while I locked myself in the bathroom with Julie. The police came and escorted Melanie off the property, and I called Fletcher as soon as they left. He filed for an emergency restraining order that afternoon. We had a hearing 2 days later, and the judge granted it immediately after hearing about Melanie trying to take Julie without permission. The order required Melanie to stay at least 500 feet away from both me and Julie. A week later, I got notice that the court had ordered a custody evaluation. The evaluator was a family therapist named Rosanna Muller, who specialized in cases involving infants. The notice said she'd be interviewing both Brett and me separately, observing us with Julie, and then making recommendations to the judge about custody arrangements. Fletcher said this was standard procedure and that I shouldn't worry because I was clearly Julie's primary parent. My evaluation was scheduled for the following Thursday at 10 a.m. at Rosanna's office. I showed up 15 minutes early with Julie in her car seat and a diaper bag packed with everything we might need. Rosanna's office was in a building downtown, and her waiting room had toys and books scattered around, even though Julie was too young for any of them. Rosanna came out exactly at 10, a woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled back in a bun and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She shook my hand and invited me into her office, which had a comfortable couch and a play area set up in the corner. She asked me to sit down and started with basic questions about my work schedule, my parenting approach, and how I'd been managing since Julie was born. I answered everything honestly, explaining how I'd gone back to work at 6 weeks because we needed the money, and how I'd been pumping and rushing home every day to be with Julie. She asked about Brett and Chloe, and I told her about finding the messages and their plans to keep Julie from me. Rosanna took notes but didn't react, just kept asking questions in this calm, neutral voice. After about 2 hours of talking, she asked me to feed Julie and put her down for a nap so she could observe. I warmed a bottle I'd brought and fed Julie while Rosanna watched, then changed her diaper and rocked her to sleep. Rosanna made more notes and thanked me for coming in. Brett had his evaluation the following week. I didn't hear anything about it directly, but Fletcher called me afterward and said Rosanna had observed Brett during one of his visits at my house. According to Fletcher, Rosanna's notes mentioned that Brett seemed uncomfortable with basic baby care tasks and frequently checked his phone instead of engaging with Julie. She'd watched him struggle to change Julie's diaper and give her a bottle, and noted that he'd asked my mom for help multiple times during the 2-hour visit. Fletcher said this would likely work in our favor when Rosanna made her final recommendations to the judge. At the next court date, Lee stood up and argued that I was alienating Julie from her father by limiting his visitation time. He said I was being vindictive and using the baby to punish Brett for the affair. Fletcher immediately objected and presented evidence that I'd actually offered Brett additional visits on multiple occasions. He had emails where I'd suggested weekend visits or evening visits, and Brett had declined all of them because they conflicted with his warehouse schedule. Fletcher pointed out that Brett was choosing work over time with his daughter, not me limiting his access. The judge reviewed the evidence and made a note in her file but didn't make any rulings that day. I found out through mutual friends that Brett and Chloe were still together and had moved into an apartment across town. Someone had seen them at Target buying furniture, and they were wearing matching hoodies like some kind of couple's outfit. The betrayal hit me all over again, this sharp pain in my chest that made it hard to breathe for a minute. But then I looked at Julie sleeping in her bassinet next to my bed, and I felt this wave of certainty wash over me. I'd made the right decision to divorce him. Whatever Brett and Chloe had together was built on lies and betrayal, and I didn't want any part of that in my life or Julie's life. I wanted something real and honest, even if that meant being alone for a while. A week later, Fletcher called to tell me Rosanna's custody evaluation report was ready and had been filed with the court. He emailed me a copy and I read through it 3 times, my hands shaking as I held Julie against my chest. The report was 14 pages long and covered everything from our home environments to our parenting capabilities to our work schedules. Rosanna recommended that I retain primary physical custody, with Brett having graduated visitation, that would increase as Julie got older. She wrote that she had concerns about Brett's relationship with Chloe, and how the affair showed poor judgment that could affect his parenting decisions. She noted that I had demonstrated consistent, competent care of Julie, and had a stable support system through my mom and my job. Brett's section mentioned his discomfort with basic baby care tasks, and his tendency to prioritize work over additional time with Julie. The report felt like validation, like someone official had seen what I'd been seeing and agreed that Julie belonged with me. 2 days before the next court hearing, Lee filed a motion to have Rosanna's report thrown out. He claimed she was biased against Brett because she'd spent more time observing him during visits at my house where he was uncomfortable. He argued that the evaluation was flawed and shouldn't be allowed as evidence. Fletcher called me right away and told me not to worry, that judges rarely threw out custody evaluations and Lee was just trying to create doubt. At the hearing, the judge reviewed Lee's motion and asked Rosanna to testify about her evaluation process. Rosanna explained that she'd offered Brett the option to be observed in a neutral location, or his own apartment, but he'd declined both, saying my house was more convenient for his schedule. She walked through her methodology and her credentials, and the judge denied Lee's motion within 10 minutes. The report stood and would be part of the evidence for the final custody hearing. I watched Brett's face turn red as the judge spoke, and Lee put a hand on his arm to keep him from saying something. 2 weeks before the final hearing was scheduled, Fletcher forwarded me an email from Lee with a settlement offer. Brett was willing to agree that I keep primary physical custody if he got standard visitation every other weekend, and 1 evening per week once Julie was weaned. It was basically exactly what I'd wanted from the very beginning, before all the legal fighting and the custody evaluation, and the thousands of dollars in attorney fees. Fletcher called me that afternoon and walked me through the pros and cons. He said we could go to trial and potentially get even more favorable terms, but trials were unpredictable and judges sometimes made surprising decisions. The settlement gave me certainty, and avoided putting Julie through a contested custody battle where Brett might say terrible things about me on the stand. I told Fletcher I wanted to accept it. The relief I felt was physical, like I could finally breathe properly after months of holding my breath. We finalized everything in the judge's chambers on a Tuesday morning. Brett sat across the table from me looking miserable, his eyes red like he hadn't slept. We went through each section of the agreement with our attorneys and the judge, signing our initials on every page. The judge made it very clear that if Brett violated the custody order, he would face serious consequences, including potential loss of visitation rights. Brett nodded and signed the final page, and then it was done. My marriage was over and Julie's custody was decided, and I had my life back. My mom stayed for another month after the divorce was finalized. She was incredible with Julie, taking over the night feedings so I could sleep and cooking meals I could freeze for later, and just being there when I needed to cry or vent or laugh about something ridiculous. She helped me set up routines that worked for both of us without relying on anyone else. We created a schedule for Julie's naps and meals and playtime that I could manage on my own. She showed me how to prep bottles for the week and organize Julie's clothes by size and keep the house from becoming a disaster zone. When she finally flew home, I felt ready instead of scared. The weeks after my mom left were strange but good. I started sleeping better because Julie was sleeping better and I wasn't constantly stressed about court dates or Brett's next legal move. The betrayal still hurt when I let myself think about it, but I was thinking about it less and less. Julie was thriving, hitting all her milestones and smiling more and becoming this little person with her own personality. I had a clear path forward that didn't involve Brett's lies or Chloe's presence poisoning my home. I could make decisions about Julie without checking with anyone or worrying about being undermined. The house felt like mine again instead of a place I was trapped sharing with people who'd betrayed me. Brett's first official visitation weekend came on a Saturday morning. He showed up at exactly 9 o'clock like the custody agreement specified, which surprised me. My mom had flown back out for the weekend to supervise the handoff and make sure I was okay. I handed Julie over with her diaper bag and bottles and written instructions, even though Brett should have known her routine by now. Julie seemed fine with him, reaching for his face and babbling like she always did. He took her carefully and thanked me in this formal voice and left. I watched him buckle her into the car seat I'd bought specifically for his car and drive away. My mom made me tea and we sat on the couch and I cried a little bit. Not because I was sad, but because it felt like this huge chapter was really ending. When Brett brought Julie back Sunday evening, she was happy and clean and fed. He'd followed all my instructions and even sent me pictures during the weekend so I could see she was okay. It gave me hope that maybe we could make this co-parenting thing work eventually, that we could both put Julie first, even if we couldn't stand each other. That week, I blocked Chloe on my phone, on social media, on email, everywhere. I told my mom I didn't want to hear any updates about her, not where she was living or who she was dating or whether she felt bad about what she'd done. My mom respected that completely and stopped mentioning Chloe at all. It helped more than I expected, not having her name come up in conversation or seeing her face pop up online. I could start to heal from that particular betrayal without constant reminders. Work welcomed me back with so much understanding it made me emotional. Anya had held my position and actually gave me a slight schedule adjustment so I could drop Julie at daycare and still make it to work on time. She let me shift my hours to accommodate Brett's visitation schedule and pumping breaks. My coworkers had bought gifts for Julie and asked to see pictures and genuinely seemed happy I was back. It made balancing everything feel manageable instead of impossible, knowing I had support at work and not just judgment for being a single mom. A few weeks later, Camilla told me about a single parent support group that met at the community center twice a month on Tuesday evenings. I almost didn't go to the first meeting because leaving Julie with a babysitter felt wrong, but my mom convinced me I needed adult time with people who understood what I was going through. The group had about 12 people, mostly moms but a few dads too, and everyone's story was different, but somehow the same. One woman's husband left her when their twins were 3 months old. Another guy's wife had addiction problems and lost custody. A mom whose partner died in a car accident when her son was a baby. Hearing them talk about their struggles and how they managed made me realize I wasn't alone in this mess. When it was my turn to share, I gave the basic version about Brett and my sister, and everyone nodded like they'd heard worse. Nobody judged me for working or for the divorce or for any of it. After the meeting, 3 women came up and gave me their phone numbers, saying to call anytime I needed to talk or vent or just have another adult around. I drove home feeling lighter than I had in months, like maybe I was actually handling everything okay instead of just barely surviving. Around the same time, Julie started sleeping through the night consistently, going down at 7 and not waking until 5 or 6 in the morning. The first time it happened, I woke up at 3 in a panic thinking something was wrong, but she was just sleeping peacefully in her crib. After a week of full nights of sleep, my whole world changed. I had energy again. My brain worked properly. I could think clearly and make decisions without feeling like I was moving through mud. I started feeling genuinely happy when I woke up, instead of just grateful to have made it through another night. Julie was happier too, more alert during the day and hitting all her milestones right on schedule. Brett and I slowly figured out a system that worked for both of us. We downloaded a co-parenting app that Rosanna had recommended and started using it for everything related to Julie. He'd send me her schedule for his weekends. I'd update him on doctor appointments and new foods she was trying. We kept every message short and focused only on Julie. No personal stuff or arguing. It felt businesslike and kind of cold, but it was so much better than the angry texts and phone calls we'd had right after I filed for divorce. He started being on time for pickups and drop-offs. I started trusting that he'd take good care of her during his visits. We weren't friends, and probably never would be, but we were becoming decent co-parents, which was all Julie needed from us. 6 months after filing for divorce, I looked around at the life I'd built and barely recognized it from where I'd been. Julie and I had routines that worked. The house felt peaceful instead of tense. I had friends from the support group who checked in on me regularly. Work was going well, and Anya had hinted at a possible promotion in the next quarter. My mom and I talked almost every day, even though she'd gone back home and she was planning to visit again next month. The divorce was almost finalized, and I'd stopped caring about what Brett was doing or who he was with. I'd built something stable and good for Julie and me, surrounded by people who actually showed up when we needed them. My mom's departure had been hard but necessary. She'd stayed for 2 months total, helping me get through the worst of everything, but she had her own life and job to get back to. We cried at the airport, and she made me promise to call her every single day, which I did. She flew back once a month for long weekends, and we video chatted almost daily, sometimes just having the phone propped up while we both did dishes or folded laundry. Having her support from a distance worked better than I expected. She'd text me encouragement before big meetings at work or send Julie little gifts in the mail. She'd stay on video chat while Julie had tummy time or tried new foods. It made single parenthood feel less lonely knowing she was always just a phone call away, ready to listen or give advice or just be there. When Julie was 8 months old, Camilla convinced me to try a dating app. I wasn't looking for anything serious, just wanted to remember I was still a person outside of being Julie's mom. I went on a few coffee dates, nothing that went anywhere, but it felt good to have adult conversations about movies and books and normal life stuff, instead of just talking about diapers and sleep schedules. One guy, a teacher named Jake, I saw 3 times before we both agreed there wasn't a real connection, but we could be friends. Another guy ghosted me after I mentioned I had a baby, which was fine because I didn't want to be with someone who couldn't handle that anyway. The whole experience reminded me that I was still young and interesting, and had a life ahead of me beyond this divorce and betrayal. Then Brett texted me one evening asking if we could talk on the phone, which was weird because we only used the app. I called him back and he sounded tired and sad. He told me he and Chloe had broken up a few weeks ago. She'd been cheating on him with some guy she met at her new job. I felt this brief flash of vindication, like karma had finally caught up with her, but mostly I just felt sorry for Brett. He'd destroyed our family and lost his daughter's daily presence for someone who wasn't even faithful to him. I told him I was sorry he was going through that, and I meant it, because nobody deserves to be cheated on even if they're a cheater themselves. He thanked me for being nice about it, and we hung up. I realized later that I didn't feel angry or hurt anymore when I thought about them together. I'd moved past it completely. The best co-parenting moment we'd had happened a few weeks after that conversation. Julie had been pulling herself up on furniture for days, and during one of Brett's Saturday visits, she took her first real steps from the couch to the coffee table. Brett called me immediately, his voice excited and proud, describing exactly what happened and how Julie had clapped for herself afterward. I could hear Julie babbling in the background, and I felt this unexpected warmth toward Brett, not romantic or forgiving of what he'd done, but grateful that he loved Julie enough to share that moment with me right away instead of keeping it to himself. We talked for 10 minutes about her development and what the pediatrician had said at her last checkup, and it felt almost normal, like maybe we really could be good parents separately, even if we'd completely failed as partners. I refinanced the house in just my name using money my mom lent me to buy out Brett's half. The paperwork took forever, and the bank required 1,000,000 documents, but finally I sat at the closing table and signed everything myself. Brett had already signed his portion, giving up his claim to the property. Walking out of that office with the house completely mine felt like closing the heaviest chapter of my life. No more shared mortgage, no more his name on anything, just me and Julie in our home that nobody could take from us. I drove home and walked through every room, seeing it differently now that it was truly mine. I started planning small changes, new paint in the living room, different furniture arrangement, making it feel like our space instead of the place where my marriage died. A year after I'd dropped Brett's phone and discovered their plans, I sat on my back porch after putting Julie to bed and realized I was genuinely happy. Not just okay or managing or surviving, but actually happy. Julie was thriving, hitting all her milestones and developing this funny little personality that made me laugh every day. Anya had promoted me to senior care coordinator with a significant raise, which meant I could afford the house payment comfortably and start saving for Julie's future. I had real friends from the support group who I saw regularly for coffee or play dates. My mom visited monthly and we talked constantly. Brett and I had figured out how to co-parent without drama. I'd even been on a few decent dates and was open to the possibility of eventually meeting someone, though I wasn't in any rush. The betrayal still existed in my past, but it didn't define my present anymore. I'd built something better than what I'd lost, something honest and stable and full of people who'd proven they deserved to be in our lives. A few months later, Brett showed up for his regular weekend pickup with a woman I'd never met standing next to him on my porch. She looked young, maybe mid-20s, with her hand resting on Brett's arm while Julie played with blocks on the living room floor behind me. Brett introduced her as his girlfriend and asked if she could come inside to meet Julie before they left for the weekend. I stepped aside and watched this woman kneel down next to my daughter, complimenting her blocks and asking what she was building. Julie showed her the tower she'd made, and the woman smiled genuinely, not trying too hard or acting fake. Brett stood there looking nervous, like he expected me to make a scene or tell them to leave. Instead, I just felt this odd curiosity about who she was and whether she knew the full story of how Brett's last relationship had imploded. I helped Julie pack her overnight bag and handed it to Brett at the door. The girlfriend thanked me for letting her meet Julie, and I realized I meant it when I said it was nice to meet her too. After they drove away, I went back inside and made myself coffee, surprised that I felt completely fine about the whole thing. No jealousy, no anger, just a mild interest in Brett's life that didn't touch me emotionally at all. That summer, I took Julie to the beach for a week with my mom and Camilla. We rented a small cottage right on the water and spent every morning letting Julie toddle around in the sand while waves rolled up to her feet. She'd squeal and run away from the water, then turn around and chase it back down the beach. My mom helped her build sandcastles with a plastic bucket and shovel, while Camilla and I sat on towels watching them work. Julie would fill the bucket with wet sand, dump it over, then smash the castle flat with both hands before starting over. We collected shells in a mesh bag, and Julie held each one up to show us before dropping it in. At lunch, we'd rinse her off under the outdoor shower, and she'd fight us the whole time, wanting to stay sandy and sticky with salt water. In the afternoon, she'd nap while we sat on the porch drinking iced tea and talking about everything except Brett and the divorce. Watching Julie splash in the shallow water with my mom holding her hands, I realized how much better our life had become since I'd left. We had peace. We had people who loved us honestly, and Julie was growing up surrounded by support instead of lies. Julie's second birthday party filled our backyard with people who'd shown up for us when everything fell apart. My mom flew in the week before and helped me decorate with streamers and balloons in Julie's favorite colors. Camilla brought a homemade cake shaped like a butterfly that made Julie clap her hands when she saw it. Friends from work came with their kids, and the single-parent support group sent 5 families who'd become close over the past year. Julie wore a pink dress my mom had bought her and ran around the yard showing everyone her new toys. Brett arrived exactly on time with a large wrapped present and his girlfriend, who'd asked if she could come. I told him it was fine and watched him play with Julie for 40 minutes, pushing her on the swing set and helping her open his gift, which was a wooden toy kitchen. He stayed for cake and sang happy birthday with everyone else, then left quietly without drama or tension. His girlfriend hugged me goodbye and thanked me for including them, which felt surprisingly normal. After they drove away, the party continued for another 2 hours with Julie opening presents and playing with the other kids while adults talked and laughed in small groups around the yard. Looking around at all these people who'd proven they deserved to be in our lives, I felt grateful for the family we'd built, one based on honesty and real love instead of secrets and betrayal. That night, I gave Julie a bath and washed frosting out of her hair while she played with foam letters that stuck to the tub walls. She was exhausted from the party but fought sleep like always, wanting to play just a little longer. I dried her off and dressed her in clean pajamas, then carried her to her room and laid her in the crib she'd soon outgrow. She held her stuffed rabbit and looked up at me with those big eyes that looked exactly like mine. I sat in the rocking chair next to her crib and thought about how discovering Brett and Chloe's betrayal had been the worst moment of my entire life, but also the thing that pushed me to build something so much better than what I'd lost. I was stronger now, more sure of myself and what I wanted. Julie was loved by people who'd earned their place in her life through consistent action and genuine care. I had real friends, a solid job, and a future that excited me instead of scared me. As Julie's eyes finally closed and her breathing slowed into sleep, I realized I was genuinely looking forward to whatever came next for us. And that feeling alone proved how far we'd come from that terrible day when I'd dropped Brett's phone and watched my old life shatter into pieces.